Can I ask you about some other limits of your argument? So most of the independent agencies by statute must include members of both major political parties. Is that a constitutional requirement?
I don't think so.
Could Congress create independent agencies with, let's say, 10 or 15 or 20-year terms?
I do think at some point, Justice Kavanaugh, that if there is not sufficient mechanisms of adequate presidential supervision, that you could have a problem. My advice to the court.
This is important.
Yeah.
Why? You got to have a theory on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a take care clause in Article 2, Section 3, and we don't dispute that the activities of these agencies are operating within the purview of the executive branch, and they should be subject to constitutionally appropriate presidential supervision.
So do they have to turn over with each new president then?
So in the case of the FTC, I don't think you want to.
And if they don't have to turn over with each new president, what's the difference between 7 years and 20 years, constitutionally speaking?
I think our position is that the FTC, no matter what kind of rule that you articulate, would be okay because we have the staggered terms and presidents have the opportunity as a practical matter to influence the composition of the FTC. You start to get into more difficult line drawing problems if you imagine hypothetical scenarios where presidents, you have longer terms and maybe fewer officers, and maybe presidents in that circumstance don't have.
What about the chair? Usually the chair has been removable at will as chair by presidents, but that's been a matter of statute for most of these. Is that constitutionally required?
No. And we know that from Humphrey's executor, actually, because at the time of Humphrey's executor, the chair of the FTC was not removable by the president, and now it was in the Reorganization Act that took place some 15 years later. The president now has that designation.
So I think putting those three together, your position would allow Congress to create independent agencies, maybe converting some of the existing executive agencies into independent agencies with no political balance requirement, with a long term, say 10 or more years, and with the chairs not subject to removal as chair. So you can imagine a situation, and I just want to give you a chance to deal with the hard hypothetical, when both houses of Congress and president are controlled by the same party, them creating a lot of these independent agencies with or extending some of the current independent agencies into these kinds of situations so as to thwart future presidents of the opposite party. And to Justice Barrett's point, I don't think we can just say, oh, that hasn't happened, so it'll never happen.
Absolutely, and I don't think that you should articulate a rule that categorically rules out the possibility that some statute in the future might not provide for adequate tools of presidential supervision.
What would be the theory? I mean, that's what I'm getting at. There's just picking something out of thin air. What is the theory?
One textual basis in the Constitution for that would be the Take Care Clause of Article 2, Section 3, which does require the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And this court could hold that that requires that the president have constitutionally adequate means of supervision, such as those that are adverted to in Part 3C2 of CLA law that discusses exactly the types of considerations to which Your Honor is referring, the designation of the chair, the staggered terms provision, and the opportunity to influence the composition of the commission, budgetary tools. All of those the FTC has, and so we're on the right side of the line wherever you draw that line. But I guess the bigger point is that historically, this is a problem. This is a problem that has been resolved through a process of political accommodation. And there's no reason to believe that that process, which has been adequate for a very long time, will not be adequate in the future. But if it is, the court can keep open the possibility that there will be time enough to decide on new constitutional rules.
How do you answer the accountability theme, which I think is the theme of the other side, is that independent agencies are not accountable to the people. They're not elected. As Congress and the President are, and are exercising massive power over individual liberty and billion-dollar industries, whether it's the FCC or the FTC or whatever it might be?
May I answer?
Sure.
It is an entirely legitimate concern, but there are countervailing accountability and liberty concerns on the other side. And so, for example, you have an amicus brief that is submitted by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in this very case that talks about real dangers to freedom of the press, to individual liberty, to free speech rights that would result from saying that agencies like the FCC are all of a sudden subject to at-will presidential removal. And they discuss the history, just as one example, this precious First Amendment right that could in every meaningful sense be jeopardized if we abandon long-standing history and retroactively invalidate the independence of independent agencies. The last thing I would say, if I may, Justice Kavanaugh, in response to that point on political accountability, is that I think it would be a really unfortunate way to vindicate the principle of democratic accountability for this court to effectively invalidate. We're not talking about 1 or 5 or 10 or even 15. We're talking about more than 24 traditional independent agencies that have been established by statutes enacted by the people's elected representatives and signed into law, all of them by democratically elected presidents. If it is really true that these kinds of for-cause removal protections, which after all authorize the president to fire commissioners just for good cause, if they really pose this fundamental threat to the republic, petitioners could take their argument across the street and Congress could solve the problem tomorrow. They're not willing to do that.
Thank you.